Hello, Jonathan Lichtenwalter here with K-Paul and Contact Mission. Many people read the book of Ruth and try to find romance in it. However, romance and marriage are peripheral to its message. The central theme of Ruth is God's inclusion of a Gentile into Israel and God's concern for people on the margins. Ruth is a counterbalance to the books of Ezra and Nehemiah that focus more on preserving the holiness of God's people and seem to forbid intermarriage with foreigners. The main message of Ruth is this: yes, the other nations are corrupt, but the Torah also gives ways that they might be accepted into the Israelite community. Here we find two ideas in tension: total separation from the surrounding nations versus a possibility for inclusion of the nations. Deuteronomy and Joshua include commands of an unyielding separation from the nations that Israel would come to inhabit, including foreign practices and relationships, meaning intermarriage was forbidden. Ezra and Nehemiah emerge when the Israelites began to intermarry with the surrounding nations. The Israelites' sin of intermarriage was considered apostasy and a violation of God's law without exception. The rationale is that these nations would lead Israel to apostasy, so a relational distance was needed to protect the identity of God's holy people. Consider this section of Ezra. When these matters had been concluded, the leaders approached me with this report: neither the Israelite laymen, nor the priests, nor the Levites have kept themselves aloof from the peoples of the land and their abominations: Canaanites, Hittites, Perizzites, Jebusites, Ammonites, Moabites, Egyptians, and Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and their sons, and thus have desecrated the holy race with the peoples of the land. Furthermore, the leaders and rulers have taken a leading part in this apostasy. Ezra 9, 1-2. In chapter 10 of Ezra, the Israelites decided to divorce their wives, sending them away with their children. Look at Ezra 10 verse 3, verse 44, and see also Nehemiah 13 verse 23. There is debate about whether this was the best solution to the problem, and the Bible is silent on whether this was the only option. But there is a second stream of Old Testament thought that both gives caveats and arguably throws a big log in the first stream, channeling the waters in a different direction. In Deuteronomy, there are multiple admonitions to care for the foreigner and alien among you, and not mistreat them. For example, Deuteronomy 24 verses 17-18 says, "You shall not violate the rights of the alien or of the orphan, nor take the clothing of a widow as a pledge. For remember, you were once slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God ransomed you from there. That is why I command you to observe this rule." The rationale here is that the Israelites were once foreigners, so they should not mistreat foreigners in their midst. Even the Egyptian, Israel's original enemy, is given special precedent to be treated kindly and ultimately accepted into the Israelite community. See Deuteronomy 23 verse 7-8. Even Genesis portrays Egyptians positively, like Hagar, and other races, even Canaanites, who are initially allies of Abraham. In fact, Abraham himself is depicted as coming from the ancestors of the Babylonians and is allied with the Amorites. Even during the conquest of Joshua, we find breaks in the narrative to show positive examples of foreign people in the nations Israel would inhabit. Joshua too has Rahab the prostitute giving her allegiance to the God of Israel and finding acceptance in the Israelite community. A little later in the narrative, we see the cunning of the Gibeonites who tricked the Israelites into a treaty because of their fear of the God of Israel. Joshua chapter 9. Hundreds of years later in the biblical narrative, we see David come to the aid of the Gibeonites because of the decision they made during the time of Joshua. See 1 Samuel 21, verses 1-14. From this second stream of inclusion in the Old Testament, the book of Ruth emerges. The book of Ruth is about the marriage of a Moabite woman, Ruth, to an Israelite man, Boaz. Ruth is called an Eshet Chayil, a worthy woman or a woman of valor, and some scholars believe that Boaz is given the imagery of God himself as a refuge who spreads his wings over Ruth in protection. There may be wordplay in Ruth 3 verse 9, since the word for robe used here can also be translated as wing. Due to this different, even opposing perspective of intermarriage in Ruth, some scholars consider Ruth a polemic against the strong prohibitions of Ezra and Nehemiah. However, I want to make a case that calling Ruth a polemic against Ezra and Nehemiah is going a bit too far. It's true to say that the book of Ruth itself supposes it was written long after the events it records. Look at Ruth 1 verse 1 and 4 verse 7. I'm unsure of how these scholars conclude that Ruth was written after Ezra and Nehemiah. I'm not a Ruth scholar. And as a response, but the tension they highlight is very real. Let's assume for a moment that these scholars are accurate in these two assertions. If Ruth were written after Ezra and Nehemiah, the writer of Ruth likely thought that, in zeal for holiness and separation from the surrounding nations, many Jews had forgotten this other stream of thought which upheld the foreigner, stranger, and widow, no matter where they were from. The author of Ruth seems to be saying, yes, the nations surrounding us are corrupt, and we need to keep our distance, but there are people among them who would be willing to give their allegiance to the God of Israel, like Rahab and the Gibeonites. There are foreigners who can be included. Ruth can be seen as a counterbalance to the fierce admonitions of Ezra and Nehemiah that were written as a needed strong response to apostasy. I would not call Ruth a polemic, but a gentle reminder that there is not just one side to this story. Both sides need to be considered. These differences can help us contemplate what kind of message is needed for a church in apostasy versus a church that in zeal has become exclusive and forgotten to care for the alien, poor, widow, and orphan. Consider how Joshua Berman, a rabbi and scholar, observes the book of Ruth in his book, Inconsistency in the Torah. Berman, with other scholarly help, supposes that the author of Ruth is likely using the laws in Deuteronomy 24, verses 16 through 25, verse 10, in the very structure of the book of Ruth. Let that sink in. Ruth is no romance. The author has taken literary pains to reflect Deuteronomy 24, 16 through 25, verse 10 in its very structure. Consider these parallels. 1. In Ruth 1 verse 2, Mahlon and Chilion die for their own sins. Elimelech for abandoning his land and people, Mahlon and Chilion for taking Moabite wives, separate from their father. In Deuteronomy 24 verse 16, fathers die for their own sins, sons for theirs. The fact that the author is signaling that these men die for their sins is an indication that the Ruth author's message is not, all intermarriage is just fine. 2. In Ruth 1 verse 3, Naomi equals widow, Ruth equals stranger, widow, and maybe even orphan. Residents of Bethlehem failed to provide proper welcome or hospitality as commanded in Deuteronomy. An ancient Israelite would have noticed the message about lack of hospitality. Consider the example of Abraham in Genesis 18 with the 3 angels. This would have been essential to the history of Israel. In Deuteronomy 24, verse 17 through 20, there are laws given for just treatment of the stranger, widow, and orphan. 3. In Ruth 1, verse 22, Boaz excels at providing for the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. In Deuteronomy 24, verse 19, there are laws about field rights for the underprivileged. 4. In Ruth 2, verse 9, Boaz instructs that Ruth not be publicly shamed. In Deuteronomy 25, verse 3, it's about saving a man from public shame. 5. In Ruth 4, verse 1, verse 5, verse 10, and verse 13, Boaz takes Ruth through levirate marriage. In Deuteronomy 25, 5-7, there are laws about levirate marriage. What's so interesting about these parallels is that they seem to follow the laws of Deuteronomy 24 and 25, yet they also seem to subvert some of those same laws. The author of Ruth is certainly not taking a statutory approach to the Torah, which is really more of a modern Western approach to law. He or she shows clear reverence for Deuteronomy in making these laws the very structure of the book, yet he or she also subverts some of these same laws. Joshua Berman says on this point, "I would suggest that the author of Ruth did not perceive the laws of Deuteronomy, or of Leviticus for that matter, as statutory law. Indeed, the various biblical law corpora do call upon Israel to observe and keep these precepts. But the observance of the precepts apparently was something that was given over from the earliest times to interpretation and discretionary judgment." Consider the first parallel. Interestingly, Ruth and Naomi's situation resulted from sin and disobedience. This didn't seem to play into Boaz's decision or God's approval. What situations today might be the result of sin where we ought to still act graciously? Consider parallels 2-4. How is the author of Ruth challenging the Israelites and us today to take seriously the needs of the foreigner, the widow, and the orphan, no matter where they're from? How are we often like these townspeople who did not care for the needs of Ruth and Naomi, and rather stood at a judgmental distance? Ruth reminds us in our zeal for holiness not to forget kindness to the stranger. Berman also notes that the townsfolk make no effort to receive Ruth and Naomi as widow, stranger, or orphans, as Deuteronomy commands. Boaz, on the other hand, does. The greeting offered to him by the field workers in chapter 2, verse 4, "May Yahweh bless you," is exactly the blessing promised to the one who allots fallen sheaves to the poor. Lastly, consider the issue of marriage to a non-Israelite. Christians often discuss relationships with outsiders by emphasizing the need for spiritual separation from them. When we use the Old Testament for this concern of separation, we are careful to refer back to Ezra and Nehemiah to emphasize total separation or passages like it. I understand why this is done, and I'm not saying it's wrong, but the message of Ruth should lead us to ask more questions. Is the world starting to lead your church to apostasy, and the only possible solution seems to be a radical break from all outside influences? Are you a church that needs to look more closely at Ezra and Nehemiah? On the other hand, does your church need to take a step back and take a look at the book of Ruth? Has your church, in its zeal for holiness, purity, and separation from the world, gone too far and needs to remember that God is also the God of the alien and the foreigner, the God of Ruth and Naomi? Regarding our outsider relationships, do we only consider Ezra, Nehemiah, and not discuss how Ruth might inform our conversation? How does Ruth call us to ask more discerning questions about a situation that is perhaps more complex than we want it to be? In an individual or church that's in an Ezra and Nehemiah situation, it calls for total separation. But is it possible that the situation looks closer to what is going on in Ruth? Ruth shows us that sometimes things are more complicated than some of us would like them to be, and thank God for it. Consider also how Ruth calls us to greater unity when we have different biases as Christians. Ruth and Ezra and Nehemiah clearly have placed greater importance on two streams of biblical narrative, yet God has chosen that they all remain in the Bible, and we can see their differences of focus today. We don't have to claim they contradict each other to say that they clearly see different parts of the Torah as more important. If different books of the Bible with authors inspired by God see things differently while keeping the essentials of the faith, can we be united in our differences? In Jesus, the streams of both separation and inclusion come to a head with the inclusion of all people in the family of God and the continued call to holiness and separation from ungodliness. Just how Jesus does this is a subject for another time. For now, I'll end with Matthew 1 verse 5 that connects Ruth to Jesus. Salmon, the father of Boaz, whose mother was Rahab. Boaz, the father of Obed, whose mother was Ruth. Let's not forget Ruth and the message she brings to God's people today. I'm Jonathan Lichtenwalter with K. Paul and Contact Mission.